Live from the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences in beautiful downtown Raleigh, it's the Science Cafe with your host, Chris Smith.
Good evening, everybody. Hey, happy holidays. How's everybody doing tonight? Fantastic. Well, welcome to the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, to the Daily Planet Cafe for Collected Curiosities. Our Science Cafe this week is all about the cool, amazing, bold, and the beautiful things that you can find in a museum collection. Show of hands, how many of you are friends of the museum or museum members? Okay, now, how many of you, have any of you taken advantage of the behind-the-scenes member tours? Any hands? Oh, fantastic, fabulous. It's cool, right? Yeah, down in the basement of the museum, there are millions with an M, of specimens collected for scientific research. So there's a lot of really cool and incredible things that you can see if you're a friend of the museum and you get to sign up for one of those cool behind-the-scenes tours. If you're not a friend of the museum, we can fix that. It is the giving season, is it not? It is the season. And a museum membership makes a fabulous New Year's Day gift. That day when everyone gives. But most importantly, you make sure you sign up for that membership before the 31st. That way you get the tax-deductible part, because it's a donation to this incredible facility that does things like put on weekly science cafes. Am I right? Okay, good. Thank you for agreeing, because we're live on TV somewhere, so it makes me look good. Well, tonight, our speaker for tonight is going to be doing a little bit of science show and tell. His name's Greg Skupian. He's the curator for the Naturalist Center, which is in this building, the Nature Research Center, up on the second floor. And it's something like the second most visited spot in the entire museum. Second, I think, only to the room where the sloth lives. So the Butterfly Conservatory is one, and then the Naturalist Center is number two. The slide that you can see up on the TV screens right now, that's part of the Naturalist Center. It's a space where people can go and actually touch and see museum specimens up close and learn about the natural world in a way that might be difficult to do otherwise. So tonight what we've done is Greg has gotten with the researchers, gone down into the collection, and figured out what some of the really interesting stuff that we have in the museum's collection right here in Raleigh is, so that we could bring it out of the basement, out of the collection, bring it into the light, and show it off a little bit. So he's done a lot of research. He put a lot of effort into picking out what I think are really some of the most interesting things that we have in this museum's collection. So put your hands together and welcome to the stage, Greg Skupian.
Thanks for having me tonight. So I saw a lot of hands go up when Chris asked if you're friends of the museum. Do we have any new folks in the audience? Anybody visiting from out of town? Is this your first trip to the museum? If so, let me see. Just a couple. Welcome. So as Chris said, I am fortunate enough to be the curator of the Naturalist Center, just on the second floor of the Nature Research Center here. And you see up on the screen my workplace where I get to show up every day to go to work. We have about 10,000 specimens on display in the Naturalist Center, which are available for the public to come in and touch and feel and look and learn from. But that pales in comparison to what we have in the research collection. So this is just one photo of the mammalogy collection down in the basement on the other side of the museum. And as Chris said, we have about 4.5 million specimens in our research collection here at the museum, which is pretty incredible. For comparison, the Field Museum of Natural History, where I grew up going as a kid, has about 30 million. So we're doing pretty good for a state-run museum at 4.5 million. And like Chris said, I worked with the researchers to put together some really cool things for a show and tell here tonight. And so without further ado, we could jump into it. I'm happy to take questions as I talk about each individual specimen, but as you can see, I have a lot of stuff up here on the stage, so we can probably limit it to a question or two per specimen, and we can have some time at the end for you to get a better look and ask some more questions at the end of the evening. And Chris is going to be my model here. He's going to walk around and show you a little bit up close the specimens that I'm showing on the screen as well. So the first one is a sharp-tailed mola eyeball. So you can see Chris has in this jar a massive eyeball from one of the world's largest fish. So this is a species of fish that can be found across the globe in tropical and subtropical environments. And they are the largest of the bony fish. So they can reach about 11 feet in length, about 4,000 pounds. And this is just one eyeball that was taken from a specimen that beached itself along the coast of North Carolina in 1992. So here's a picture on the screen of what the sharp-tailed mola looks like. Many of you may be familiar with its cousin, the ocean sunfish. But this is a very closely related species, about the same size, and one of the things that differentiates it is the little nub at the end of its tail. You can see a little projection at the back of the fish. That's one way to tell it apart from the ocean sunfish. We used to have one of these specimens on display. This is a picture from our archives from about 1930. So you can see the sharp-tailed mola on the right side of the screen, and then on the left side is the ocean sunfish, or the common mola, which is actually still on display today on the second floor of the Nature Exploration Center. So this is an image of that ocean sunfish. This was taken back on May 31st of 1926. The fellow there on the right is H.H. Brimley. He was the first director of the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. And he went out with a colleague and collected this specimen off the coast of North Carolina. They had intended to make a plaster cast of this specimen at the location, but for whatever reason, the plaster never showed up. And so they wound up saving the fins, some of the skin, and they took really detailed measurements. It was kind of hard to see on the screen there, but on the left side is their plans. They took measurements of everything. The mouth of this fish was only about 3 inches by 5 inches. For an animal that's like 11 feet long, it has a really tiny mouth. All they're really eating are slower fish, jellyfish, sponges, so things don't really move that fast. So they have a really small mouth for such an exceptionally large animal. But you can see on the right there, this animal is still hanging, again, next door in the Nature Exploration Center on the second floor. So if you get a chance sometime later this week, go check it out. That thing is, 91 years old. Around the same time that Brimley was collecting that ocean sunfish, another researcher collected this smooth pufferfish off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina. So this specimen was collected in 1927. And Katie's going to come help out. So museum collections are more than just collections of curiosities, although the name of the presentation might imply otherwise. They can be used for some really interesting purposes. So what's really special about pufferfish is obviously they can puff up. And to be able to do so, they've actually lost many of their ribs and their pelvis. So this is an image taken of a cleared and stained museum specimen. And on the top, you can see a pufferfish skeleton. And if you compare it with the zebrafish there on the bottom, you can notice that the pufferfish is missing a lot of the ribs up in the middle portion of the picture there, and it has no pelvis. That makes sense because when these fishes are inhaling water or sometimes air, they need to inflate, and if they had ribs there, they'd get in the way. So keeping cleared and stained museum specimens like this help us study the anatomy and physiology of species such as the pufferfish. Another unique feature of the pufferfish is they have this very bird-like beak. So here you see a skull from the smooth pufferfish. That's the same specimen that Katie's carrying around in the ethanol, but it very much has a bird-like appearance to the skull. And using museum specimens, researchers have determined how that beak forms. So what happens, the pufferfish actually starts out with normal rows of teeth, just like most other fishes. And then when those teeth get replaced, they fuse into these rows that turn into that beak-like projection. So these guys are eating things like shrimp and crustaceans and other fishes, so that beak is really helpful for crushing their prey items. But just another cool example of how museum specimens can reveal the anatomy and physiology of species. So Chris, I'm going to need your help with this one. I wouldn't call it scary, more heavy. I don't think I could handle it with the mic in my hand. I think you'd be able to get it. So this is the saw of a large-toothed sawfish. Many of you may have seen this, if you're friends of the museum, on the cover of the latest Naturalist issue. We had some researchers here from LSU taking DNA samples from our sawfish specimens. The dried specimens like this are a good source of DNA, and they're interested in looking at how genetic diversity in these species has changed over time. There are 5 species of sawfish throughout the globe, and all of them are critically endangered. That's because people have harvested them for trophies. That's most likely how we acquired this one. Somebody would have killed the animal for that saw and then donated it later to the museum. But they also face other threats like habitat loss. These are large fish. They can get up to about 25 feet in length, 1,500 pounds, and they live in the near-shore environment, and they'll often come up into rivers and lagoons and estuaries as well. So as our habitat is lost, we lose the species as well. But this is the largest of all the sawfish rostrum, or saws, in our collection. And this was one that was sampled earlier this summer and will be used in that genetic study through LSU. That's an excellent question. So the question was, what does the fish do with that saw? So they use it really for 2 purposes. One is to catch and subdue their prey. So if they see a fish or some other prey item in the water, they'll rapidly move it from side to side to stun their prey, and then they can eat it. They also use it as defense. As you can imagine, if that on the end of a 20-foot sawfish could do some damage if something was trying to predate it. There's only been evidence of really some sharks and crocodiles predating sawfish this large. The main threat is humans. Yeah. They do have teeth. So that's an excellent question. So what we're looking at on the end of the saw are actually modified scales. They're called denticles. So those are modified scales, and then in their mouth they do have teeth as well. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting, the mother gives birth to about 7 to 10 young about every other year. And you can imagine, that could be quite painful, giving birth to something that has that on the end of its head. And so the young, their saws aren't fully developed, and they're actually born with a protective sheath on the end of the sawfish. And here's just an image of one in the wild. The sawfish is actually a species of ray. And again, we have some extra copies of the Naturalist if you want to read about that research collaboration going on with graduate students from LSU. So next, we have a diversity of hummingbirds. So one of the main reasons for keeping things in museums' collection is to record biodiversity. And there are about 340 species of hummingbirds throughout the world. And the greatest diversity of those are going to be found in the Andes Mountains. That's because those species were diversifying as the Andes Mountains uplifted about 10 million years ago. So based through all those changes in elevation and habitat types, we see a great diversity of hummingbirds. So what I have here is just a sampling of those, and I'm going to pass these off to Chris to show you. The first one is known as the giant hummingbird. So as the name implies, this is the largest of all the hummingbird species in the world. It's about the size of a swallow. It's not really impressive in terms of birds, but for a hummingbird, that's really big. The smallest is only about 2.5 grams. And I'm going to pass this off to Chris as well so he can show you the comparison between the largest and the smallest of all the hummingbirds. And so we all know that hummingbirds love to drink nectar. Most of us have hummingbird feeders in the backyard. But especially during the breeding season, hummingbirds will get about 50% of their diet from insects, which is pretty incredible. And the most incredible, in my opinion, of all the hummingbird species is the sword-billed hummingbird. This is the only bird species in the entire world to have a bill longer than the length of its body. And you can imagine holding up a bill that large when you're such a small bird can be pretty cumbersome. So when they perch on a branch, they actually have to hold their head at a steep angle so that their center of gravity is over the branch and they don't tip forward. And here's a picture of that sword-billed hummingbird in action. The question is, what's the function of the long bill? And so the hummingbirds co-evolved with their nectar sources. And so they adapted to feed on flowers that have a really long flower to them. So as I said, the greatest diversity of hummingbirds resides in the Andes Mountains. A little closer to home, we have the Tundra Swan. And I was fortunate enough to go to the coast about 2 weeks ago to see tens of thousands of these Tundra Swans. Has anybody had the chance to go to eastern North Carolina to see this phenomenon? Just a couple people. So I highly recommend taking advantage of our natural resources in the great state of North Carolina. Currently, there are about 70 to 75,000 of these large tundra swans along the coast of North Carolina. So these birds spend most of their time in the tundra, as their name implies, in the Arctic Circle. They spend the summer there reproducing, and then in the winter they'll fly down to areas throughout North America, and North Carolina happens to be one of their favorite stopping grounds. So these are large birds, up to about 15 pounds with a wingspan of about 60 inches. And on the left of the screen, you see some of the birds coming in for the night. So these birds are, during the day here in North Carolina, they spend their days eating like leftover grains and other crops that were in the agricultural fields, and then at night they'll fly into the ponds and lagoons in eastern North Carolina. And if you time it right, you can be there around sunset to see tens of thousands of these massive birds come over the top of you as they land in the water. Since we have so many in the state of North Carolina, it is one of the few places where you can hunt them legally. About each year, they give out about 5,000 tags for big game hunters. And so the mounted specimen that I'll show you here in a second was one of those animals that was hunted legally and then donated to the museum. We don't normally take mounted specimens just because they're hard to store, but this is a great educational piece. It's going to go on display in our Whiteville branch in eastern North Carolina. But again, One of the best spots to see these animals until about late January or February is the Pocosin Lakes National Wildlife Refuge. It's only about 2.5 hours east of here, and I highly recommend checking it out before the birds go back to the tundra for the summer months. You want to help out, Roy? We'll give you the awkward one.
Now serving lovely.
So the question was, why is the bird mounted at that angle? That one was mounted to hang on the wall. So the way that Roy is holding it, it would actually be rotated 90 degrees. But yeah, this one was donated just about a month and a half ago. The gentleman that shot it was actually the first state epidemiologist. He served the state of North Carolina for like 50 years in some capacity, but he was an avid outdoorsman. He also donated several wild turkeys, partridges, ptarmigans, but unfortunately he recently got sick and had to downsize to a smaller house. So we got the phone call and accepted some of those taxidermy specimens from him. So another bird visiting from the tundra is the snowy owl. Let me see a show of hands. Who's heard about the snowy owls recently in the news? Okay. So the snowy owls are currently going through what is known as an eruption year. Eruption with an I, I-R-R-U-P-T-I-O-N. It means more like rushing in. And so you can see on the right side of the screen, all those dots are locations where snowy owls have been spotted this year. So what happens up in the tundra, snowy owls eat a lot of lemmings. And the lemmings go through cycles. About every 4 years, there's a lot of lemmings, which means there's lots of food for these snowy owls. So they'll eat up, they're happy, they're reproducing, they're making lots of baby owls, and then they'll make their way down here to the lower 48 states during the winter months. And so on the left side of the screen is actually a photo of a snowy owl in downtown Detroit, Michigan, on top of a parked car. And it's hard to see on the map, but we actually had a snowy owl, a couple sightings in North Carolina. I missed seeing it on the coast. It was over on Pea Island around December 17th, and we missed it by a day or so. So when I was home in Chicago for the holidays, I made my family go on a trip to go spot one of these snowy owls. We were on our way to my sister's wedding. She was getting married in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I made the family leave like an hour earlier so we can go look for a snowy owl. They all thought I was crazy. It was like negative 20 degrees on the shores of Lake Michigan with the wind chill. So I jumped out of the car and I was looking. My parents don't have any binoculars. All they have are a pair of opera glasses from like the 1920s. And I figured that was better than nothing. So I'm looking at the shores of Lake Michigan with opera glasses and negative 20 degrees like a fool. My mom was in the car, nice and warm, and she actually found the bird within like 5 minutes or so. So they thought I was crazy, and you should have seen her face when she discovered that owl. She was so excited. So here's a quick selfie I took, and the bird you can see hidden behind the fence there. It was just hanging out on a flower planter next to a terminal that takes people over. There's a shuttle that takes you across Lake Michigan from Wisconsin into Michigan, and that's where it's spending its winters. And it's probably hanging out there eating other birds, small mammals, really whatever it can find. But these animals are having an excellent year in the lower 48 states. If you have a chance, I would recommend going out and trying to see one. Again, not too many are here in North Carolina. You'd have to go a little further up north to have a good chance of seeing one. All right, where's Chris? I need somebody strong. He's got the bird in the back. It's a walrus. Can you? It's pretty heavy. It is heavy. Yeah, unless you want to switch with Chris. Yeah, so once in a while we'll acquire specimens from far outside the scope of North Carolina. We are a state-run museum, and most of the items that we have in our collection focus on animals in and around the southeast United States. But this is one of the exceptions to that. These are walrus tusks. We don't really have a lot of information on where they came from. Best as I could tell, they were collected sometime in the 1960s. But these tusks can weigh up to about 15 pounds and be about 3 feet long. What Katie has on that board there is actually part of the skull as well as the tusks. That's why she's struggling to carry it. It probably weighs about 40 pounds or so, wouldn't you say, Katie? Yeah, about 40 pounds. But that's really nothing if you think about the size of these animals. A bull or a male walrus can weigh up to about 4,400 pounds. Get up to like 12 feet long. And they use these tusks for many reasons. Of course, the males are going to use it to defend their territory, to protect their harem. They'll also use it to lift themselves out of the water. And they can also use it to basically break holes in the ice from below so they can come up and get a breath of air. And Chris, do we have that skull? Another use for museum specimens is to serve as a reference. So many years ago, our mammalogists came across a skull in the basement of the museum. We come across all these crazy things, and sometimes they're not labeled. And so they found this really weird skull and had no idea what it was. So it took a couple of researchers quite some time to figure out what they had, and they eventually confirmed it based off of another specimen that we had in the collection. So what it turns out is they had a walrus skull. Why, again, a museum in North Carolina would have a walrus skull, they really don't know. But it's something that we were able to tell based off of the reference specimen in the collection. And since that specimen has also been added to the research collections down in the basement of the other building. So I'm going to give them a few minutes to walk around with those. Do we have any questions in the meantime? Yeah. Yeah, so the question was, do the tusks come out of the skull? The tusks on a walrus are actually canine teeth. So yeah, they're coming out of the skull of the animal. And if Chris flips it around as he walks by, you can see the location of the other teeth. That's an excellent question. I don't know what those stone-like objects are in the skull. That's a question for the mammologist. Yeah, I didn't notice those. Yes, sir. Yeah, so the question was, do we have to do anything to preserve the specimens? So it depends on what state they come to us in. So if that walrus skull had a lot of tissue and flesh on it, we use dermestid beetles. You can actually see that taking place on the second floor across from the Naturalist Center here. And those dermestid beetles will eat a lot of the tissue, the fat, and the muscle off the skull. And then a lot of times it requires what's known as cold water maceration, where you just basically leave the skull in water until it gets those little bits off. When I went to go pick up the walrus and the polar bear specimens today, the mammalogists were working on just that, but with little tiny shrews and mice. And so the beetles had eaten the flesh, they had soaked it, and then they had to sit there with tweezers and get the remaining bits of flesh off the little tiny mice and voles and shrews. It seemed like a tedious job. I ran the other way. Any other questions before we move on? The whole, so that would have been the nose. Yeah, that's the front of the skull there. Is it considered ivory? Yeah, typically ivory is reserved for the tusks of walruses, elephants, rhinos, and things like that. Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the question was, since we can't accept everything, do we try to focus on certain animals, or do we just take everything that we get? So yeah, one of the main issues with any museum is storage. And so we have to be selective in what we accept here at the museum. And again, since we are a state-run institution, we try to focus on animals native to North Carolina and then the southeastern United States. So some of our researchers also work in other areas of the world. One of our herpetologists works in Southeastern Asia, so he has a collection of frogs in particular from that area. One of our ornithologists does a lot of work in South America, so he has some specimens from there as well. So it's really dependent on what the researchers are focusing on, and then also focusing on this area of the world. So one of the few animals that could potentially eat and kill a walrus is none other than the polar bear. And some of you may have seen polar bears in the news recently. There is that video going around of the very emaciated polar bear. And so what I have here is a specimen that was collected in about, I think it was 1962. So nowadays you wouldn't be able to go out and hunt polar bears unless you were part of the indigenous communities in the Arctic areas of Canada and Alaska. But prior to 1972, it was very much illegal legal to hunt and import trophies back into the United States. So that's how we acquired this polar bear. Somebody had shot and killed it back in the 60s. This one comes from northern Alaska, and then it was later donated to the museum. So this one's big. I'm going to set down the mic, and Chris is going to help me unfold it for you. And you can see he's fallen apart a little bit, but that happens with specimens. Sometimes pieces, be it bone or fur, will fall off. But we store these things in bins or drawers, so we'll keep all those pieces together. But again, this is an animal. A large male can get up to about 1,600 pounds. These are the largest land carnivores in the entire world. The only things that could rival it in size is the Kodiak brown bear, in Alaska as well. They have hollow fur, as you probably know, and then the skin underneath it is black, and those are two adaptations that allow it to, first of all, appear white in the light, and also to absorb extra heat energy from the sun. And then their massive size is another adaptation that allows these animals to thrive up there in the Arctic. This one's a little too big. We're not going to walk around with it. Chris is shaking his head no. But there are about 19 subpopulations of polar bear in the world. A couple of those are declining. A few are actually increasing in size, and the rest are stable, or we just really don't know what's going on with them. They've been recently listed as threatened, by the United States underneath the Endangered Species Act, and they're also listed as vulnerable by the IUCN. And that's largely in part because of the effects of climate change. As you probably know, these animals require sea ice to hunt seals and the occasional walrus. And if we see a reduction in that sea ice, you would expect to see a reduction in the number of polar bear numbers as well. Any questions about the polar bear?
Yes.
That's a good question. I don't know the answer. A good reference is the IUCN. The Red List is a website that lists really detailed information about threatened and endangered species, and they'll have more information specifically as to where they're doing well and where they're not. Yes. Yeah, so he commented that the hair is transparent, and that is absolutely correct. They have hollow hair. So sometimes you'll see green polar bears. That's because algae will grow inside those hollow hairs. But what that hair does is, in the sunlight, it reflects that light and makes the bear appear white. They used to think that it had something to do with conserving heat energy, but that's not the case.
Dropping it. There's a lot of polar bear dropping there. That's not so cool.
Or the weasel, excuse me. So another use for museum collections is studying climate change. So what they're carrying around now are 3 long-tailed weasel specimens. And so in the images on the screen, you'll see on the bottom is a specimen collected in North Carolina. So the long-tailed weasel is brown year-round in our state. That's because we don't get a lot of snow. But if you go up to areas like New York or Colorado, they change their colors during the winter months. And that change in fur color is largely dependent on the length of day. And so some researchers working at the University of Montana were looking at museum specimens, including some of our own. They were looking at snowshoe hares and weasels and other species that change color. And what they predict is as climate change affects the planet and we see fewer days of snowpack in northern areas like New York and Colorado, there's going to be a mismatch. So you're going to have bright white weasels on, brown and green backgrounds. So their camouflage is not going to work, right? They're going to stick out because there's no snow on the ground. So this was a study that was published just a couple years ago, and they're continuing to use museum specimens to look at when and where these weasels appear and in what color phase they appear. So the next specimen is a hellbender. They also go by the name of alligator, snot otter, all these other weird names. So this is one of the largest species of salamander in the entire world. You up for this one, Roy? So this is a salamander. This one was collected in North Carolina about 12 years ago. They are part of the family of giant salamanders. There are 2 other species, the Chinese giant salamander and the Japanese giant salamander. And we are lucky enough to have the hellbender here in western North Carolina. This species really prefers like really fast, cold moving rivers and streams. That's because they take up oxygen from their skin. As that specimen goes around, you can see along the side of their body they have a lot of wrinkles. That's known as frills. And those frills help increase the surface area of this salamander's skin so it can take up more oxygen from the water. And so one of the main threats to this species is sedimentation. So when we come in and we develop near these rivers and streams, we see more sedimentation into our rivers and streams, which decreases the amount of oxygen in those environments. It also fills in the areas that these animals like to hide. Here you see an image of the hellbender underneath a rock. I had the privilege to go out last August and search for these. The state of North Carolina began a research project back in 2007, where each year they go out and they monitor the hellbender populations of the New River, so in the very northwestern corner of North Carolina. So basically what you do is you go and you find a big rock about the size of the table that you're sitting at, and you flip it over. You can't see anything, so you're kind of like blindly grabbing to find this really large, squishy thing. And if you're lucky enough, you come up with a hellbender. And then what the state does, they'll measure it. They put a little pit tag in it. Those pit tags are the same things that you might use to chip your cat or dog. If they get lost, you can scan it, and it reads the number and tells them who it belongs to. So the state has been monitoring the hellbender since 2007. They are a species of special concern, so it's illegal to go out and harvest them or collect them from the wild. So the question was, do they start out with gills when they're young? Yes. When they're young, they have gills. The adults have gill slits at the base of their throat, and they also take in oxygen, again, through those frills along the side of the body. Another unique thing is, so the males will actually guard the eggs. The female lays the eggs underneath these large rocks, and Papa hellbender will hang out and guard those eggs from any predators until they hatch. And they can lay several hundred eggs, but only a couple dozen are going to actually survive. So this is one of my favorite turtle species, the Diamondback Terrapin. Is anybody familiar with this one? A few people. If you're a Maryland Terps fan, you've rooted for the Terrapins. So this is the only species of turtle that inhabits the estuaries along the east coast of the United States. So they like brackish environments, saltwater marshes. So you're going to find them frequently in the intercoastal waterway. So you can find them all the way from New York along Florida into the Gulf of Mexico and Texas. And there are about 7 subspecies of the Diamondback Terrapin. And what happened back in like the 1920s, this was a really popular item to eat. So Diamondback terrapins were almost wiped off the planet because people loved eating them. That also meant that we were collecting them and moving them all up and down the East Coast. And so those 7 subspecies kind of got mixed up a little bit. And so I've done some research down in South Georgia with these animals, and you see a great diversity in their appearance. They're exceptionally beautiful animals. The females are much bigger than the males. That's because they need room for those eggs. And one of the major threats to them nowadays is not so much eating, but the threat of habitat fragmentation and roads. So these turtles will come out of the marsh, and they look for like a high, dry place to lay their eggs, and a lot of times they encounter cars along the roads. So here you see a female along the road with some cars headed in her direction, and unfortunately, road mortality is a big threat to these animals. But once in a while, you'll see a good news story like this. Turtles, let's see what it says. Turtles delay flight at JFK Airport while mating ritual. So what happens is the turtles come out of the marsh. They don't care that there's jets trying to land or take off. They're just looking for a good place to lay their eggs. And so I've seen this headline multiple years where the females come up and there's like 30 or 40 turtles on the runway at JFK, and they have to shut down the airports temporarily. They have a crew of volunteers who will actually come out and rescue the turtles. But this usually happens in like May or June when the turtles are up nesting. It's hard to tell. That one's like right in the middle in terms of size. If I had to guess, I would say a female. Mm-hmm.
that tried to rescue, to save animals that had been injured, for example, in encounters with cars. And they had some examples of turtles that they had done extraordinary things with to try to save them.
Yeah, the North Carolina State University, they have their turtle rescue squad. They do a lot of good work rescuing injured wild turtles. So these two are some of my favorite specimens in the entire museum. It doesn't seem like much based on the picture, but the ecology, the parasitism at play here is diabolical. Chris is going to walk around and show you. So what you see pictured and what Chris has in his hand is known as a tongue-eating isopod. Now, this is the stuff of science fiction. So what happens, isopod is similar to like those roly-polies that you might flip a log in your backyard and find hanging out underneath that log. About half of the species of isopods live in water, most of them being marine and hanging out in the ocean. This particular type of isopod, what they do, they start out, they're all male, and they'll just latch on to any old fish that they find. As they start to grow, they look for a particular host species, and they latch on to that fish. It could be like a snapper, one of the common fish here along the coast of North Carolina. And so the isopods, they attach to the gills of the snapper, and they're all still male. And then one of them will decide to turn into a female. And she will crawl up and attach herself to the tongue of the snapper and start to eat it. And she eats that tongue until it's nothing but a little nub. And then she attaches herself to the base of the muscle. And so what you see here is the isopod has essentially replaced the tongue of the fish species. And what's even weirder is that in some cases, the fish can use that isopod like a functional tongue. Eat and just carry on its daily life just like it had a normal tongue. What's even weirder is there's the female who's now basically the tongue, and the males are still hanging out in the gills, and it's thought that they reproduce right there in the fish's mouth. And you can't make that stuff up. You can't see the tongue in this picture. It's kind of like the lighter thing right there in the middle. So that's the lower jaw of the fish, and then right there in the middle is the isopod itself. Yes, where it's as you said, it's kind of frilly. It's the segmented animal right there in the middle. So there's a picture of the isopod in the species when the fish is still alive. So they don't kill the fish. They might not be as fit as other animals that don't have an isopod as a tongue, but they don't kill the animal. Any questions about that one? Yes, sir, in the back. How do they reproduce? I don't know the specifics about the reproduction of the tongue-eating isopod. There are some excellent videos online. It was Nat Geo or PBS has a really nice video talking about the life history of the tongue-eating isopod. Go home and Google it. All right, sticking with the isopod theme, I'm going to have to set the mic down for this next one. I got this one. So this, again, is another type of isopod, again, related to the tongue-eating animal that we just saw, related to those roly-polies or pill bugs that you see in your backyard. But there are 20 species of giant isopods. 4 of them live in the Atlantic Ocean. The rest are in, like, the Indian and Pacific Oceans. And this is the only one that you can find off the coast of North Carolina in the United States. And for this one, I'm going to set the mic down and get a little messy.
Katie, can you hold the mic? Can you hold the mic for Greg?
So this is the giant isopod that lives along the coast of the United States. These animals, they typically prefer like deeper waters. They can live up to about 7,000 to 8,000 feet underneath the surface of the ocean. They are scavengers. They'll feed off of dead whales or whatever else floats down to the bottom of the ocean. But they are carnivorous, and they can hunt slower moving animals as well. Their front legs here are modified to help them move the food into their 4 sets of jaws. But again, this is the only one in our waters. 20 species around the world of giant isopod. A couple of questions over there?
Let me go get.
Are they edible? And two, do they taste like lobster or chicken?
I have no idea. Do you want to come find out? It's soaked in rum for the past 20-some years. Yeah, so she asked, is it considered a living fossil? They've been around for hundreds of millions of years. This particular species, I don't know how long it's been around, but the first fossil record of isopods was recorded something like 300 million years ago.
What kind of rum was it preserved in?
It's ethanol. You don't want to drink it.
Isopod would suggest same feet? It's
Yes.
or something like that. How do we interpret that?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to it.
Here we go. Here we go.
Is it a crustacean? What is it?
Yeah.
It's a crustacean. Wow.
Is it related to the horseshoe crab? Is it related to the horseshoe crab?
Distantly, I don't know where it'd fall in the family tree, but you can make the argument that everything's related, but I just don't know where it's at in relation to the horseshoe crab.
So the isopods are still in the group arthropod. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
So that would mean that, yes, they have a relationship with your shrimp, your lobster, your crab. So it probably does taste like lobster if you really wanted to get down to it. It's more closely related to your shrimps, lobsters, but also all the way out to butterflies and millipedes, all in that one giant group of animals we call the arthropods.
So I'm going to end it there and give you a chance to ask more questions, or we can bring stuff around, show you a better look at some things that may have passed very quickly earlier in the evening. There are some things that I didn't cover that I have up here, some fossils from Columbian mammoths, fossilized feces known as a coprolite. So if you have any questions, I'll take them now, and then we can get you a better look at some of these specimens that we have up here.
Let's give Greg a round of applause. Appreciation for digging all this stuff out of the basement. Wow. So, yeah, if you do have more questions about anything you've seen so far, there was a question, Greg, about the terrapin specimen and how that was made, how it was preserved.
So the terrapin specimen is actually freeze-dried. So there's a whole book on this, how to freeze-dry biological specimens. It's not a practice that's really used very commonly in museums nowadays. That's because it preserves the entire specimen. So everything is in there, which makes it really prone to insect infestation. But in the Naturalist Center, I have a whole collection, largely of reptiles and amphibians that have been freeze-dried. And it uses what's known as sublimation. So the animal is frozen, and then in this chamber, that frozen water is changed to gas without going through a liquid stage, which would make it all soggy, and it gives you a nice dry turtle or frog or whatever else you're working with.
So for many of the animals that are increasingly endangered, like I guess lots and lots of frog species all over the world, do our researchers have to use other methods of documenting what they see rather than bringing home live specimens? Or dead specimens?
Yeah, to a degree, with threatened and endangered species, it's less likely that you would collect that species. There are other methods nowadays that you can use, photography, DNA. I know with some species of frogs, you can take a little tissue clipping from the toe, so you have that genetic material. Researchers in the biodiversity lab on the second floor here are using camera traps to study mammals in particular. So there are other methods to studying threatened and endangered, and really all species nowadays. Gone are the days that museum curators would go out and just kill thousands of animals and put those into the collection. But yeah, there are alternatives nowadays.
If you got a question, show of hands.
This is not an animal, but it is an animal product, and that is ambergris. Do we have any of that in our collection? Was it found off the coast of North Carolina?
Yeah, so that's ambergris is collected from whales. Whether or not we have it in our collection, I do not know. Chris, you have any idea?
I don't
Roy?
think so.
Yeah.
I don't believe that we do.
Don't know. Chris, you want to help me out on this one?
Ambergris is, Glenn, you might know more than me, but it's whale snot.
Yeah.
No. Whale poop. I got close. But specifically, right, but specifically from sperm whales, and it is at least at one point, was a common ingredient in fragrances and in perfumes. And I think per gram or per kilogram, if you can find it, it's worth thousands of dollars to the pharmaceuticals or cosmetics, excuse me, to the cosmetics industry. So if you've got some nice fancy perfumes at home, it's probably got sperm whale stuff in it.
How many specimens do you have in your collection that are of animals that are currently extinct?
That is an excellent question. Roy, do you have any idea?
I know for certain that we have Carolina parakeets in the collection.
Yeah, I'm not certain as to how many. An interesting story, I've been here for about 2.5 years, and shortly before I arrived, we received a donation of 3 birds. We get a lot of these where the husband passes away or the spouse is sick, and so they turn to the museum to accept their donation. And in the donation of 3 birds was an Eskimo curlew, which is now an extinct species. So that came to us through a donation, and she had no idea what she had. We have Carolina parakeets, passenger pigeon.
And I know that in the herpetology collection, there's at least a handful of frog and amphibian species that are now at least thought extinct as well.
Yeah, of course, the dinosaurs.
And we have lots of non-avian dinosaurs. Thank you, Roy.
Oh, sorry. So you talked about the LSU students that were up here doing the DNA studies on the sawfish bill. Do you have to be more careful now than ever before about handling the species that you have so that it doesn't interfere with the DNA sampling, or is that not a problem?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I don't know enough about DNA, the analyses that they're using, but you wouldn't want to contaminate the specimen with your own DNA, your skin cells. I imagine they have a way to isolate the human DNA from the fish, but I'm just not sure.
I'm going to say that's all the time we've got, because I want to make sure that if there are other things that you want to see, you've got the opportunity to come up to the stage and take a look even closer maybe at some of the cool specimens that Greg brought up for us. So let's give Greg one more round of applause. And I'll remind everybody that we do science cafes every Thursday night here at the Museum of Natural Sciences in the Daily Planet Cafe. So definitely come back and see us again next week. Next week, though, is the first Thursday of the month. And for those of you that know, what's the first Thursday? Trivia. It's going to be science trivia. Come back, bring your team, play for prizes and glory in the world of science. I hope we'll see you again here at the Science Cafe. Good night, everybody.